I'm Sam Gannon. Welcome back to the Vanderbilt Linkages Scholarly Writing and Publication Session 4, entitled The Writing Process. Up until now, we've mapped out kind of where do you begin, how do you look at targeting a journal, how do you look at a literature review, how do you look at the ethics process, how do you make an outline, a timeline, a scope of work, all of these pieces that you need to prepare to actually do the writing. And in this session, we're going to start unpacking some of those terms and some of those things that you want to consider during the writing process. Now, because the writing process is a little bit different for each person, we're not going to get too granular with our discussion, but we hope to share with you some tips and some strategies that you can use to help you improve your writing process. In this segment, which is the first of 3 segments, we're going to be talking about getting started. Some of the things that you want to consider as you're getting started, and maybe keep those in your mind as you're working on your writing project. Okay, let's get started. With so much to write, where do you begin? So we've kind of talked about this a little bit. Where do you start with your article? Do you start with the methods section? Do you start with the introduction? Do you start with the title and work all the way through to the references? What's your process? So let's say that I issue a challenge today and I tell you I'm going to give you 24 hours to write a 1,000 word article. We've got a tight deadline, we need it tomorrow. On anything of your choice as long as it's something about your research. Where would you begin? What piece would you write first as you're making your draft? And I'm guaranteeing you it's going to get published. It's going to be perfect. It's going to be in a high impact journal. Where do you start? What are your first steps? So I'm going to give you a couple of seconds here to think about that and think about where are you going to start with this? What's your first step? I'm sure that if we went around and asked everyone in the group today, there'd be some different answers. Perhaps some people would start at the beginning and work all the way through to the end. Maybe some people would start talking about the innovative aspects, maybe the rigor that we talked about in session 3. Don't know, but I'm sure the answers will vary. Here's a nice quote from Charles Darwin. Guard your first draft with your life. Fortunately, I think we may be past some of those days where you're actually got your pen and paper and you're guarding that and hiding it away. It's now electronic. It's in the cloud. It's somewhere out there in the cyberspace, perhaps, that you're guarding it just as well. There's some resources in the guide for this session on how to back up your draft and how to back up your notes, so you can look at those and see if you have any other suggestions for me to add for the next iteration of the guide. Let's move on. So you want to define the process. In our last session, we really talked a lot about timeline and scope of work and the importance of the outline and understanding the anatomy of an article. That's part of that, defining the process. Now that you're ready to sit down with your notes, with your outline, with all the things you put together, you're ready to write. And what do you write? Sometimes the hardest part is the first letter. The famous phrase is the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. Well, you're ready for that single step. So having defined the process, which is hopefully something you've already done now, right, is central. It's the key to creating the conditions for success. If you just randomly went out and started writing things down and eventually you said, oh, I think it's an article, and save and print and send, I don't know that you'd get the same outcome. If you've got English as a second language, and you're writing in English, and the challenge then becomes, how do you write in a language that's not your mother tongue? How do you write for a formal audience on an academic level to be peer-reviewed in a language that is not the first language you learned? It's not the language you perhaps speak most of the time. So there are 2 real things that you want to do if English isn't your primary language or your mother language or your first language. And I'm very lucky that I guess I have English as my first language. that I don't really have to think about it as much. But you want to make sure that your writing is conforming to the standard grammatical, syntax, the rules of language. So perhaps you want to get someone who is a native English language speaker or someone who has it as their first language or their mother tongue to read it for you and make sure that it's conforming. Perhaps you want to enlist a formal editing or editor process. There are a lot of resources online that can help you with this if you don't have an individual that you can turn to. So you want to make sure it's conforming, that it's following the rules of language. The second thing is that you want it to be understandable. You may know from your own language that sometimes the rules and the grammar and the guidelines for syntax and how we put together writing in our languages doesn't always make sense. Idioms are a great example. You probably wouldn't want to write using a lot of idioms in your scholarly writing, but turns of phrases and things like that. You want to make sure that it's understandable and that it's appropriate for the audience that you're targeting with your journal. So having someone read that for you will be very helpful. So let's talk about writing style. Okay, there are several things that go into writing style that you want to take into consideration because perhaps every article that you write is going to have a different writing style. So there's your discipline. So even among, say, humanities, or even among the hard sciences or the basic sciences or the biomedical sciences, the disciplines will vary within the sciences. There are even within, say, the biomedical sciences, some humanities aspects that follow a humanities style approach in their writing. So you want to make sure that however you're writing is appropriate for your discipline. You also want to make sure it's appropriate for the article type. So let's say you're doing a randomized controlled trial. That's going to have a very different article than a letter to the editor or a commentary. So you want to make sure that it's appropriate by looking at a few of the articles like the one that you're working on or like the one that you're submitting. You can get kind of a good feel for how they should be written or how you should write them. And then lastly, you want to look at the journal itself. Whatever journal you've targeted or selected to submit your scholarly writing to is probably going to have some guidelines on how they want things done. So let's take a look at some of the guidelines that you're likely to find when you're submitting to a journal. Okay? So first off is the format. So what font do they want you to use? That's a very basic one. What's the point size? What margins do they prefer? What file type? Do they want a PDF or do they want a Word document or some other format, a Google Doc? How do they want to receive your work? Are there other formatting guidelines? Do they have a policy on widows and orphans and what those look like and how those feel? Are kerning and leading and line spacing and all of those pieces that can be tinkered with throughout your writing process. So you want to make sure that if there are any formatting guidelines that you're following up with them. And if you're thinking to yourself, I don't know what widows and orphans are, maybe there's a policy I need to read, you can look those up. There are resources online that can help you determine what those things mean. Kerning and point size and leading and fonts, all of those are out there to help you better understand the format. Your journal may even have a template guide that they want you to use. It's a Word document perhaps, and it's already got the pagination set up. It's already got the margins set up. It's already got the font selected and the point size and all of those important considerations. So look and see if there's perhaps a template that you can just utilize that the journal has already made for you. Okay, do they have a length? And how do they measure the length? The lines, the pages? Does their length come in number of words? All of these are great considerations because if they have a word limitation, but you also have 3 charts and 2 tables and a picture, that's going to change the length of your article. So you want to think through length issues and be very deliberate in how you're reading and interpreting the length. And if you need to, reach out to the journal editor or editors to ask them about your specific questions with length. Organization. Is there a particular way they want your submission organized? We went through a typical format last time in session 3. Maybe they want an introduction and they also want a literature review. That's maybe something that they tend to like with this journal. So you would want to separate those out. So you want to look at the organization and see specifically what they want them called, what they want the sections called, and how they want them organized. They may even be very specific and say, well, your discussion must be at least 20% of your paper, and your methods must be at least 25% of your paper, and your introduction must be at least 15% of your paper. And they've got it all measured out for you. And you want to be sure that you're following that journal guidance as you're working on your manuscript. Next is the language. You want to make sure that you're following the language guidelines. So if you're submitting to a publication that's based in the UK, are you using British English? Are you using American English? What English are we using here? Are we using a very formal style, or is it informal? Is it colloquial? What are the language expectations? Do you need to have a glossary? Do you need to define terms? And if so, what terms need to be defined? So thinking through some of these issues will be helpful for you. Also, there's the submission requirements. How are you supposed to submit it? Are you submitting it on paper in 20 copies? Or are you submitting it via email in a PDF document or a Word document? Are you submitting it through an online portal where you're uploading it to their website? So think through submission issues. If you've got to mail it and you've got to have 20 copies, that's going to add a little bit of time onto your timeline to make those copies, to go and send them off in the post, to perhaps have them postmarked by a certain time or to be received by a certain time. Electronic is definitely going to get you more time. It's also going to save you a little bit of money in terms of how many copies you have to do in all of those pieces. So think through submission. Are there any special requirements that you have to have? Do you have to have an acknowledgement section? Do you have to... I don't even know. Are there restrictions on references and resources that you can use? Are there specific requirements on the table size and the point size for tables? Pieces like that you want to be considerate of. So think through any other special requirements, and those should also be listed in the journal's guidance page. Is there a citation style that you want to use? I mentioned before, different disciplines have different citation styles that they use. Some of those are overlapping across disciplines and academic areas, and some of those are quite limiting. So if you're in a school of medicine or school of dentistry or nursing, you may follow an APA citation style when you're writing a curriculum piece or an education piece, and use a totally different style when you're writing a more biomedical clinical research trial findings piece. So think through your citation style, think carefully about those issues, and look that up. Identifiers, do they want you to put in tag words? In today's modern era in open and online journals, they may want you to put some identifying phrases or tags or some kind of additional identifiers that will help situate your publication within their larger world. So you may be asked to stick those in there and think kind of through that hypertext piece. And then the ethics piece. Do they want to see a conflict of interest? Do they need for you to complete that? Do they want to see a copy of your IRB or your IACUC approval letters for use of human or animal subjects? So these are just a few of the journal considerations that you want to be thinking about and looking and checking for to make sure that, that you're following all these. As there becomes a lot more submissions and it's harder and harder to get your journal article published, perhaps, you want to be sure that you're following all the guidelines, because sometimes it only takes one thing. Maybe you didn't follow the format for them to say rejected, and you've lost your chance for that quarter or for that annual or biannual, semi-annual publication. Lastly, let's remind ourselves to follow our outline. We made an outline in session 3. Hopefully you did a scope of work that outlines exactly what you're going to do, that outlines your sources, that you've got your notes organized, you're ready to go. You've got that outline. If you get lost along the way, perhaps you get, excited about one section, or you have some results, or you want to work on a table, or you really don't feel like it today, and you get off track, go back to your outline. That's your map. Just like we talked about backward design, we can't really go somewhere if we don't know where we're going. Well, we can, but it's kind of difficult to know that we've gotten where we wanted to go if we didn't know where we were going. I know that's circular thinking, but before you take that trip, before you start off on your journey, it's helpful to know where you're going and to have a map to help you get there. So if you ever lose your way and get off the map, you can always pull out the map, figure out where you are, where you're going, and what it will take to get you there. That's what your outline really is. So take that outline to heart. Keep it somewhere where you can have it with you. If you've got a special binder that you're keeping all your work related to this paper in, Put it in the front or stick it in a pocket in the front of your binder so you can pull it out. Use it as a checklist as you finish each section. Kind of draw a line through it, or if you're counting the words for each section or the lines or the pages, you can note those on your outline as well to kind of help you keep the pace and know where you are, know where you're going, and know what you have to do. So hopefully this getting started piece has been helpful as we enter the writing process. Next, we will talk about establishing a routine. Thank you so much, and between now and the next segment, I want you to talk about routines and how you set a routine and how difficult it is for you to have a routine or stay on a routine. Please, as always, reach out to me. You've got my email address if you want to send comments or questions or issues to me, and good luck with your publication.